not funny! You got my fucking taser.
We concluded and considered it as one of our important considerations that Mr. Brooks never presented himself as a threat.
Today we're going to review the press conference that the district attorney in Atlanta had about the Rayshard Brooks case and the reasons why he said he's going to charge the officer with murder. Welcome to the channel. My name is Nate. I'm an attorney, former law enforcement officer, former prosecutor, and welcome to the Broady Bunch. Now, before we get started, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to this video because this video is going to be demonetized, obviously because of the content. Now, the DA in the Rayshard Brooks case perplexes me. Now, Rayshard Brooks was the black man who was killed by Atlanta PD officer Garrett Roth in a Wendy's drive-thru. Now, that shooting was captured on videotape. Now, just to be clear, that video was awful. But the core question here is whether it was criminal. Now, remember in my last video, this DA stated unequivocally that a taser was a deadly weapon under Georgia law.
As many of you all know, under Georgia law, a taser is considered as a deadly weapon under Georgia law.
I remember even in the last video, we looked at the Georgia Supreme Court's ruling in 2019, which also said a taser is a deadly weapon under Georgia law. And last but not least, we looked at the Atlanta Police Department's standard operating procedures for the use of deadly force, which says that when a suspect has a deadly weapon and uses that deadly weapon against an officer can respond with deadly physical force. Now, if you want to see all that, the analysis and everything, click on the link above. So now as it stands, the DA from Atlanta has charged the officer with murder. Yeah, he's charged them with murder. So let's check out the facts. Now, before we get started, we need to know what the standard is in which police conduct is going to be judged. A unanimous Supreme Court in 1989 in a case called Graham v. Connor decided what the standard is that police officers are going to be judged with nationwide. The Supreme Court said that if a law enforcement official used excessive force in the course of making an arrest, investigatory stop, or other seizure, that person's conduct will be judged and analyzed under the Fourth Amendment's objective reasonableness standard. Now, under this standard, a particular application of force must be judged through the perspective of a reasonable officer facing the same set of circumstances without the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, and be based on the totality of the facts that are known to that officer at the time the force was used. Now that we know the standard, let's go through the clips and see what the DA is presenting to us. So the first thing we want to look at is, was Mr. Brooks drunk?
And one of the things that we noted from our evaluation was that Mr. Brooks on the night of this incident was calm, he was cordial, and really displayed a cooperative nature. Secondly, even though Mr. Brooks was slightly impaired, his demeanor during this incident was almost jovial.
So the DA does admit that Mr. Brooks was drunk. Matter of fact, he blew over the legal limit. Now, I want you to hear the officers talk to each other about the assessment of Mr. Brooks' driving condition when they were determining the next steps to take in their interactions with Mr. Brooks.
How's it going?
So, found him passed out in the parking lot, just sitting here.
So he was in the drive-thru?
Yeah, he's on, car's on. Took me like a few minutes to wake him up. Kept knocking, opened the door, like shook him. Woke up super groggy, got pretty good smell of alcoholic beverage coming out of the car. Eyes are watery, glassy. Slurred his words, wasn't really sure where he was. And telling me he had one drink, he said earlier. Standard size, tried to say, I think just one drink, but I can smell alcohol on him still. And he's trying to tell me, where are you coming from? He said, well, I'm coming from Jonesboro, I got food. And I said, what are you doing here? I got more food. So he's really not too clear, like, I got here, got there. But I mean,
so this was a 911 call, right?
Yeah, the drive-thru called it in.
So somebody called because he was in the drive-thru.
He just passed out in the car.
Passed out in the drive-thru?
Yep.
Okay.
That's
and then you just had him pull over to the
side. I
side.
had to move out of the way, and then when he pulled up, he actually hit over the curb onto the grass and, like, backed it up.
Okay.
So I leave him here, he's just going to drive again.
Sure, absolutely. All right, let me go talk to him. What's his name? Do you have his ID?
Yeah. This is a rental car.
Let's just be clear, Mr. Brooks was drunk. Matter of fact, he was over the legal limit. You had the smell of alcohol. He couldn't speak in coherent sentences. And on top of that, when they asked him to pull the car into a parking spot, he ran over the parking spot into the grass and had to put the car in reverse. The DA is acting like the fact that he was inebriated doesn't matter. But I think it does. He was drunk, and he knew it. And so did these cops. So now, let's go on to the DA's next contention, that Mr. Brooks didn't know he was being arrested.
The fourth thing we noted is that Mr. Brooks was never informed that he was under arrest for driving under the influence. And this is a requirement of the Atlanta Police Department when one is charged with a DUI. The Atlanta Police Department's own procedures require that that person is informed immediately that they are under arrest. And then he was grabbed from the rear by Officer Roth, who made an attempt to physically restrain him after the 41-minute and 17-second discussion.
Now, so we're all on the same page. Generally, the standard to determine if someone's under arrest is that would a reasonable person think that they were under arrest in that situation and not free to leave, right? That's generally the standard to determine if somebody's under arrest or not. So let's look at the actual video and see whether a reasonable person in Mr. Brooks' position or anyone's position would have believed that they were under arrest.
You want to give me a burger or something?
Right.
Just take me home. I'm ready to go.
So you had about 1.5 drinks, but you don't remember what kind of drinks they were?
No, sir.
All right.
I really don't, Mr. Ross.
All right, I think you've had too much to drink to be driving. Put your hands behind your back for me. Here, put your hands behind your back.
So then the Atlanta DA goes on to say this about Mr. Brooks and whether he was a threat to the officers or not.
We concluded and considered it as one of our important considerations that Mr. Brooks never presented himself as a threat.
Well, we have the video, right? We can see if he was ever a threat to the officers. Let's go to the videotape.
To drink to be driving. Put your hands behind your back for me. Here, put your hands behind your back. Hey, stop fighting! Stop fighting! Stop fighting! Stop fighting! You're gonna get tased! You're gonna get tased!
Stop, Mr. Ross.
Stop!
Come on, man.
Stop! You're gonna get tased!
Mr. Ross.
Hey, hands off the fucking taser! Hands off the taser! Stop fighting! Hands off the taser! Stop fighting! You got my fucking taser!
This is where facts collide with reality. Again, these are the facts. You judge them for what they are. From the video that you just saw, was Mr. Brooks a threat to these officers or not? Now, next, the DA then goes into the officers not giving aid to Mr. Brooks after he was shot. Now, they've charged the officers with misconduct, essentially, and not rendering aid in a timely manner. So let's hear the district attorney explain why this was so egregious.
Once Mr. Brooks was shot, there is an Atlanta policy that requires that the officers have to provide timely medical attention to Mr. Brooks or to anyone who is injured. But after Mr. Brooks was shot, for some period of 2 minutes and 12 seconds, there was no medical attention applied to Mr. Brooks.
So after Mr. Brooks was shot, the DA is saying for 2 minutes and 12 seconds that no aid was given to Mr. Brooks because essentially the cops were heartless criminals who left him on the street to die. But we have the videotape. So let's look. Let's see if what he's saying is accurate. Let's just not take his word for it, right? He's a DA. He's a political appointee. He may not be giving us accurate information. So we're going to look at the videotape again. You're subscribed to me because we look at the facts. let's just look at the facts. So we're going to watch the tape right before the shooting, and then we're going to see when officers then have the opportunity to assess the situation after Mr. Brooks has been shot. It's important to be mindful of the clock that's above the screen so we can be mindful of the 2 minutes and 12-second time frame that the DA is saying that no aid was rendered. So now the first officer gets to Mr. Brooks while he's down right after he was shot at exactly 23 hours, 22 minutes, and 55 seconds. Now, at this point in time, officers have to do a couple of things. First, they got to assess if Mr. Brooks is still a threat. Remember, he had a taser. He was very violent right before. So you got to assess, well, is this person still a threat? You got to assess if he's actually been shot because he could have missed. And then you got to determine what type of medical assistance is needed. It may be a grazed wound, so maybe you need bandages. Or if he's critically injured, you're going to need more equipment like a defibrillator or something. Now, most officers have med packs or trauma bags within the car. So in case something like this was to happen, they can go and grab that med pack and then put gloves on, mask, whatever they need to render aid until medical professionals can get to the scene. And that's what happens here at this particular scene. These officers evaluate the situation, and it takes them about 1 minute time.
Come on, man.
Now, I've advanced the video to now 23 hours, 23 minutes, and 55 seconds. Exactly 1 minute after Mr. Brooks was shot. They did their initial assessment to see what type of aid he needed. And now you're going to see the officer run back to his vehicle to get his med pack.
And these fucking assholes shooting in the Wendy's drive-thru for no fucking reason. For no fucking reason.
So now you see the officer at the car gathering the medical equipment, the defibrillator, the gloves, the mask, everything that he needs to render aid. We're close to about 1 minute, 10 seconds after Mr. Brooks has been shot. So I've stopped the video here because now Officer Roth has all his equipment, he has his gloves on, he has the med pack, and he's going to now rush back over to give Mr. Brooks aid.
Fucking shoot him! The fuck? Fucking pigs, dude! Every fucking time!
Now, at 25:01, the officers now have their medical equipment, they have their trauma bag, and they are rendering aid. So in those 2 minutes and 8 seconds, the officers assess the situation to see if Mr. Brooks was still a threat. They determined that medical assistance was needed. They went and retrieved the equipment necessary to render aid. They called for an ambulance, and in the span of 2 minutes and 8 seconds, they started rendering aid, protecting both themselves and Mr. Brooks, because let's not forget, there's a pandemic out there. You can't just start giving a person CPR because he may have been affected with the virus and may be infecting Mr. Brooks. So you need that equipment to protect Mr. Brooks from any further injury. This is what happened in those 2 minutes and the DA says 12 seconds. I count 2 minutes and 8 seconds. But this is what happened. Does that sound like they just did nothing for 2 minutes? Again, you're the jury for that.
Hey guys, what's going on? This is Nate from the future. That's Nate from the past. And Nate from the future has a problem. Nate from the future got to a part of my research and it disturbed me. It disturbed me a lot where I had to personally kind of sit back and consider whether I was bringing you accurate information. So I re-researched the pieces that I already researched, and I've just decided to bring it to you again to recut that part of the video because it was so disturbing what I believe the Atlanta DA had put forward. So now I'm going to take you to the part of the shooting and the way the DA presented it and where I feel the DA has gone too far. In the DA's press conference, the DA explained why he was charging the officer with murder, particularly for the shooting. The shooting he considered to be an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. So let's look at how the DA describes the situation with the stills photo.
What this photograph illustrates is the point that Officer Roth at this point was firing a taser, and this is Mr. Brooks, who was firing a taser as well, but I don't know if you can see it clearly. The prongs from the taser were actually fired above Officer Roth's head. I'd like for you to also look at the position of Officer Roth and Mr. Brooks, that they are here next to this red automobile. If we look at the next photograph, if we look at the next photograph, we'll see that the positions of both parties, they've changed. Mr. Brooks has now moved away from his original position, and we estimate the distance is probably about 12 feet. And Officer Roth has moved about 10 feet from the position in what is our exhibit number 1. This second video or second still shows the very instance that the shot was fired into the back of Mr. Brooks. And we have also calculated the distance, and the distance that they are apart at that time was 18 feet 3 inches at the time that this shot was fired. So based upon that information, we have concluded that Mr. Brooks was running away at the time that the shot was fired.
Okay, so you've seen the DA's presentation of the shooting and what had occurred. And then there's a second part in here where the DA talks about the taser being shot twice and the fact that the officer should have known the taser was shot twice, and that with that knowledge, he'd have known that even if the taser was pointed at him, it was ineffective. So we're going to look at both of those assumptions. All right, so the first contention that the DA is making is that the taser was fired twice, making it inoperable, and that this officer should have known that. So let's look at when the tasers were both first fired, and let's see if the officer definitively knew the first taser was fired. Let's check it out. Now, one thing that you guys have to also appreciate at this time is Officer Roth here, if you take it back frame by frame, has just taken what I consider to be two very, very, very strong punches to the head. Let's go back. The first one is coming here, which is just a glancing punch. And then the second is this right hook to the side of the head. So you've taken a right hook to the side of the head. This is your ear, neck area. Anybody who's been punched in the head understands that this is going to make you a little loopy. Now, it may have made this officer loopy. It may not have. This is something you have to take into your evaluation if you're saying the officer definitively knew that the taser was shot twice. His state of mind and his condition at the time. He's just taken a right hook flush to the side of the dome.
Let's see how he responds to that. The punch staggered him back, and now watch as he's trying to get his taser out, but struggles a little bit. Obviously effects of that right hook. He has the taser out and he's pointing it. Now, listen carefully because you can hear the taser discharge. Let's try to nail down when both tasers discharge. Did you hear that? Did you hear one taser or did you hear two? Let's rewind it. 10 seconds. Tell me if you hear one taser or two.
Fucking taser.
Did you hear one or two tasers? Mr. Brooks has the other officer's taser. He points the taser at the officer's head. Now, this is what makes tasers deadly weapons in the hands of civilians. That's just because they're not trained how to use tasers. When you're trained to use a taser, you don't tase people in the face, in the neck, or even the heart area. You're supposed to aim for particular points on the body that wouldn't cause deadly or serious physical injury. If this officer is shot in the face with these prongs and it goes into his eye, he will be seriously injured. Or if he's tased in the head, he could be seriously injured or even die. So let's continue on with the video from this point. So just let me go back one more time so we can see if we can hear two tasers firing or was it just one taser firing?
Fucking taser.
It's really hard to know if that was just one taser fire or two. It sounded like two. It could have been two. But are you going to take that chance? Are you sure it was two? Are you sure it wasn't two? You've just been punched in the head. Now, let's go to the actual shooting.
63.
So now we are here. We are here at the point where Mr. Brooks is here and the officer is behind him. And they're in front of this red car. Now, you saw that in the DA's presentation. Mr. Brooks is running away from the officer, pointing a taser back at the officer. And the officer's running with the taser pointed at the suspect. Now, we're going to advance frame by frame. Now, if you can look right here, you'll see that little puffy discharge of stuff. It looks like smoke almost. Those are the lead wires coming from the taser. Now, if you remember, we didn't see that earlier, but we see it clearly here. Here you have one clear shot from the taser. But are you confident you've seen two? Here's a frame-by-frame shot where Mr. Brooks is still pointing the taser back at the officer. He has shot it one time at the officer that went above the officer's head, and now is still pointing it. We can see his taser goes down, he's pulling up his service weapon, and Mr. Brooks is still pointing a taser back at the officer while running away. The officer now has his weapon drawn, and this is the point in the video. Officer Roth has his weapon pointed at the suspect. The suspect has a taser pointed at the officer. So think about this. At this moment, you're an officer. Someone's pointing a taser at you. Did he fire it once? Did he fire it twice? Or two?
Fucking taser.
He's tried to shoot you in the face with it, right? It went over your head. And now you have your weapon pointed out at this suspect who has a deadly weapon under Georgia law pointed at you.
As many of you all know, under Georgia law, a taser is considered as a deadly weapon under Georgia law.
Now, let's just play it from when Mr. Brooks was pointing the taser at the officer to when the officer shot. So this is when Mr. Brooks and the officer's pointing a gun at Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks is pointing a taser at the officer. Let's see what happens. So this was, like in the NFL, they called them a bang-bang play. The officer was pointing a gun at Mr. Brooks. Mr. Brooks, even though he was running away, was pointing a taser at the officer at the time his gun was up. And the officer fired 3 times, hitting Mr. Brooks in the back, but that was because his back was presented to him when he was holding the taser behind him, threatening the officer. This concerned me because the way the district attorney presented the still shots was making it seem like this officer waited and then shot Mr. Brooks in the back in some type of retribution. Do you see that here? Do you see an officer watching someone run away who's not a threat and then firing 3 times to their back? This is why you need to be the jury. This is why you need to do the research. This is why you need to stop and look at these things. I don't understand why the district attorney would put out these stills to make it seem like the officer did something nefarious. But I don't want to question his motives. I don't want to question his ethics because, as an attorney, you don't want to do that. But this is this is highly concerning. This is highly concerning. It was so concerning that after I shot this portion of the video yesterday, I deleted those portions and I said I have to actually research to make sure what I'm seeing is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm seeing. Back to Nate from yesterday. Now, just got to be clear. This video is going to be demonetized for a couple of reasons. Number one, the graphic nature of the content. And the only way that I can continue to bring videos like this is through viewer support. Patreon, PayPal, things of that nature. That will help me get to the next level so I can continue to bring you this type of legal analysis. So if you find yourself to be so kind, please look at some of the links below and help me out in that department. Now, the question for you: do you believe these officers were charged correctly? Or do you think they shouldn't have been charged at all, based on the evidence that the DA has presented? I'll see you in the comment section. Peace.